Hey, welcome. You finally have arrived at the last theoretical lecture of CNS, and today we'll be talking about blood supplying of the CNS as well as the sensory afferent pathways. So, first of all, we have here the blood supply. Most importantly, there's posterior cerebral artery, which are formed at the bifurcation of the basilar artery, which then turns laterally and posteriorly, passing above the crus cerebri. Then it runs backwards along the lateral aspect of the midbrain, where the posterior cerebral artery would supply the inferior and medial surface of temporal and occipital lobes. It gives off two branches, the posterior temporal and the internal occipital arteries. Then here we have the cerebral arterial cycle. It includes the anterior communicating artery, middle cerebral artery, posterior communicating artery, and posterior cerebral artery. Then the internal carotid artery supplies greater part of the brain with also contents going to the orbit, origin from the bifurcation of the common carotid artery, level of the upper border of the thyroid cartilage. It terminates intracranially within the middle cranial fossa, medial to the anterior clinoid process of the sphenoid. It ascends to the base of the skull, posterior laterally to the external carotid artery, and then medially. It leaves the neck via carotid canal of Peters temporal bone, passes upwards and forwards via cavernous sinus, piercing roof of the sinus, turns backwards, then divides into anterior and middle cerebral arteries. It doesn't provide any branches to the neck. However, it has the anterior cerebral artery and the middle cerebral artery. Also, carotico-tympanic branches within the carotid canal, pterygoid arteries, pterygoid canal, meningeal branch, posterior communicating artery, anastomosing the middle and posterior cerebral arteries, the anterior cerebral artery, arising at the bifurcation of internal carotid artery, dorsally to the optic nerve and communicates with one another with the anterior communicating artery. It passes along longitudinal fissure, supplying medial aspect of hemispheres till the parietal occipital fissure. Then there's the middle cerebral artery, continuation running to the lateral cerebral fossa, terminating as cortical branches. These supply a lateral aspect of the hemispheres. Then there's the ophthalmic artery and its branches. Then we go to the veins. We have the superficial and the deep groups. All veins are devoid of any valves, as are the dural sinuses. We start off with the superficial group, taking origin from the surface of the cortex and subcortical white matter. It has the superior cerebral vein, draining middle surface of hemispheres, joining superior sagittal sinus. Then inferior cerebral veins, collecting from the inferior surface of hemispheres, and joins the basilar sinus. Then the superficial cerebral vein, receiving blood from the veins of the surface of hemispheres, joining cavernous sinus. The deep group has the internal cerebral vein around the roof of the third ventricle. From the choroid vein, thalamus striates, septal, epithalamic, and lateral ventricular vein it collects blood. Then the basilar vein, under the medial part of anterior lobe, receiving anterior cerebral, deep middle cerebral, and inferior striate veins. Great cerebral vein empties into the rectal sinus, receiving blood from internal cerebral, basilar, occipital, posterior callosal. This is like the revision. We already had this in previous lecture. But blood supply of internal capsule, of course, anterior limb of internal capsule, we have the proximal and distal medial striate arteries, which are branches of lenticulostriate arteries, branches of the MCA, of globus pallidus, predominant head, tail, caudate nucleus, general, posterior part of anterior limb of internal capsule. General, then for posterior limb, both affected by the anterior choroidal artery. And as we know, lenticulostriate arteries are the end arteries. In case of an hemorrhage localized at putamen, it can rupture ventricular system, resulting in contralateral weakness, contralateral loss of pain and temperature sensation, and blood of the spinal cord, of course. The arteries of the spinal cord, anterior spinal artery always arises within the vertebral artery, same for posterior spinal artery. We also have the veins. They're all interconnected via vasocorona. Now here's something more interesting. The afferent pathways, or somatosensory pathways. First of all, we have the pathways for touch and pressure. First of all, there's a first neuron located in the dorsal root ganglion. The ascending branches posterior column. Then fibers from a lower limb would lie medially to fibers of trunk, upper limb and neck. Then we have a synapse within the gracile or connect nuclei of the medulla oblongata, where the second neuron is located. Then around central gray matter, the axons cross the midline and ascend as a medial lemniscus to the thalamus, where we have the third neuron, the ventral posterior lateral nucleus. Then the axons of the ventral posterior lateral nucleus ascend through the internal capsule to the postcentral gyrus. Then general sensation from phase by the trigeminothalamic tracts, from receptor cells of pain and temperature to trigeminal nerve via thalamus to trigeminal ganglion, the first neuron. Central branches entering pons and scanning into the lower medulla spinal tract of trigeminal nerve. The synapse and spinal nucleus of trigeminal nerve, the second neuron. Then crossing midline and joining spinal lemniscus, ending in ventrothalamic nuclei to third neuron, projecting the lower part of postcentral gyrus. Then about the pathways of proprioception and its information. It may reach either a conscious level, the cerebral cortex, or at the cerebellum reaching unconscious proprioceptive fibers. Within the dorsal root ganglion, the first neuron can reach its impulses to the cerebellum via three pathways. Branches of first neuron, ascending posterior column of spinal cord, would go to the lateral connate nucleus of medulla, second neuron. Then fibers arise within the ipsilateral and inferior cerebellar peduncle to the vermis, anterior lobe of the cerebellum. Important pathways for touch, pain, temperature are spinal thalamic tract and spinal reticular, spinal reticulothalamic tracts. The pathway for light touch. First of all, impulses of course run from the receptor cells. First neuron is the dorsal root ganglion within spinal nerve. We have a synapse in the posterior horn of spinal cord, second neuron, crossing midline through white commissure and ascending as the anterior spinal thalamic tract to thalamus, the ventral nucleus, third neuron. Then the axons ascend through the internal capsule to the postcentral gyrus. Pathways for pain and temperature. Spinal nerve, we have the first neuron. Cell bodies being located in spinal ganglion. Then fibers are scanned in the dorsolateral tract. Synapse within the posterior horn. The second neuron crossing cord in the anterior great commissure, forming lateral spine-thalamic tract as the spinal meniscus to the thalamus, where the third neuron ventero posterior nucleus is located. And then the axons or ventral nuclei with a scan through the internal capsule. With the anterior and posterior spinocerebellar tracts, the first neuron would synapse in posterior horn of the gray matter. Second neuron would arise crossing immediately and scanning in the anterior spinocerebellar tract to the vermis and anterior lobe of cerebellum. It is mainly a cross pathway. Meanwhile, the posterior spinocerebellar tract, its first neuron, is synapsed in thoracic nucleus, posterior horn of gray matter. Second neuron arising to the ipsilateral posterior spinocerebellar tract through the inferior cerebral peduncle to the vermis, anterior posterior lobes of the cerebellum. This is an uncrossed pathway. And we are following scanning tracts. Mostly posterior funiculi rise from medial bundle, carrying mechanosensation for the meniscal system, and proprioceptive fibers terminating within the dorsal nucleus. Scanning fibers from intervascular fasciculus and septomarginal fasciculus, respectively. The lower limb is represented in the gracile fasciculus, and the upper limb and trunk in the cuneate fasciculus. Lesions give ataxia. You also have an anterolateral system with the anterior spinothalamic tract completely crossing, terminating in the cerebral nuclei of the brainstem tegmentum and intralaminar nucleus dorsithalamus for light touch information to glabrous skin and causing slow secondary burning pain. Then lateral spinothalamic tract terminating thalamic ventral posterolateral nucleus. Fibers are mostly crossed but not completely, and it causes sharp pain and temperature. Spinotactile tract is cross-secondary in anterolateral location, terminating deep layers of metacephalic central gray matter and superior colliculus. Spinocerebellar tracts with, of course, spinocerebellar tracts carrying uncrossed fibers from dorsal nucleus, located in posterior lateral peripheral location, forming posterior cerebral peduncle, terminating spinocerebellum. They carry impulses from proprioceptive inputs from muscle spinals, exoceptive impulses, for example, even mechanoreceptors for the footpad, and the anterior spinocerebellar tract in the periphery of lateral funiculus, originating from contralateral neurons crossed and form the anterior cerebral peduncle. Others would be spinal olivary tracts, compound spinocerebellar pathway, spinal reticular tract, comes anterior spinothalamic tract of the paleo portion. Now, there are several pathways in spinal cord which belong to pyramidal and extrapyramidal tracts. Here is the setting of each of the pathways within the spinal cord. We distinguish anterior funiculus, where their anterior fasciculus proprius is the proper tract, its pyramidal tract anterior corticospinal, and somatosensory anterior spinal thalamic. The rest are extrapyramidal, lateral, medial, vestibulospinal, reticulospinal, pontoreticulospinal, interstitiospinal, tactospinal, spinal. In the posterior funiculus, we find one proper tract, the posterior fasciculus proprius, and two somatosensories, gracile and cuneate fasciculi. In the lateral funiculus, first the proper tract, the lateral proper fasciculus, then one pyramidal tract, the lateral corticospinal tract, three somatosensories, lateral spinothalamic, anterior posterior cerebellar, trigeminal spinal. Rest is extrapyramidal, fasciciospinal, ruberospinal, minor bulboreticospinal, levospinal, spinotectal, spinolateral, spinotectular, hypothalamus spinal, spinovestibular. Okay, the reticular formation is a mixture of both gray and white matter located within the midbrain, pons, medulla oblongata, and spinal cord. The dendrites have few branches, axons of ascending direction. These axons are able to connect and have contact with many neurons and conduct impulses to all kinds of brain areas. Here are the locations: spinal cord, intermediate gray substance, its central part, and brainstem nuclear reticular formation divided into central, medial, and lateral ones. First, we have a median. It includes rougher nuclei with afferent fibers of the hypothalamus, limbic system, prefrontal cortex. Then the medial nucleus reticularis gigantocellularis, reticularis pontis, heterogeneous, is part of the ascending arousal system. Intermediate has locus coeruleus, nucleus ambiguus, afferent fibers, hypothalamus, limbic system, nucleus solitarius, and cortex. Lateral nucleus parabrachialis, tegmenti pedunculopontinus, has afferent fibers to limbic system, amygdala, hypothalamus, cortex. There is also median nuclei with nuclei of medulla oblongata, pons, central gray substance. Its central reticular nuclei are known as tegmental nuclei. There's the medial and lateral reticular nuclei, located around the central group, where, however, the pons does not contain a lateral group. There's the gigantocellular nucleus, lateral reticular nucleus of the medulla oblongata, rougher nuclei with a medulla oblongata pons, nuclei of locus coeruleus, pons, institution nucleus, peduncular ponta and tegmental nucleus, in the midbrain and reticular nucleus of thalamus. There are certain tracts, scanning proper tracts connect the nuclei. This formation passing in proper fasciculi of spinal cord. One example being the central tegmental tract. They are highly expanded and join all parts of reticular formation. Spanning tracts connect with all parts of CNS, spinal reticular, cerebellar reticular, tector reticular, cortical reticular, and so. Then the scanning tracts going back to many parts of CNS, reticulospinal, reticulothalamic, and reticulocerebellar. Also has connections with the limbic lobe, autonomic nervous system, hypothalamus. So its functions are it's responsible for conscious watch, external stimuli, participating in mechanism, determine cycle, sleep, waking, pathways of reticular formation, influencing action of important life centers, for example heart work, breathing, arterial pressure, and these neurons secrete neurotransmitters which participate in concrete functions, acting as unspecific mediator between sensory systems, cortex control, vital vegetative functions such as respiratory and cardiovascular functions, and sleep-waking cycles. Also controls muscle tone and myotatic reflexes. Also central transmission of sensory impulses, and its cardiovascular functions are controlled by the solitary tract nucleus, sending efferents reticular formation, receiving fibers from baroreceptors and carotid sinus and the aortic arch. It includes an ascending reticular activation system. So in case a lesion placed in the reticular formation brainstem will produce a coma, sleep. Now there are also many nuclei of the cranial nerves. First of all, we have the motor nuclei, which begin in the end nuclei in the brainstem with the posterior medial column. Nucleus abducent nerve, lever facial, collicus pons, hypoglossa, middle oblongata, trochlear, tegmentum midbrain, oculomotor, tegmentum midbrain, anterior lateral. We have the nucleus ambiguus, middle oblongata, facial motor nucleus, pons, geminal motor nucleus, also pons, nucleus accessory, cerebral part of spinal cord. Then the parasympathetic, superior salvatory nucleus, pons of CNV2. First of the nucleus, middle oblongata for CN9, dorsal motor nucleus of the vagus, middle oblongata, accessory nucleus, oculomotor nerve, midbrain, nuclear sensory functions, somatosensory, nucleus of trigeminal, middle oblongata, pons, midbrain, nuclear spinal tract, CN5. Special sensories, there are the cochlear nuclei, anterior and posterior pons, vestibular nuclei, pons and medulla oblongata, nucleus of the solitary tract, CN7, 9, and 10, medulla oblongata. Okay, afferent pathways for special senses. We distinguish in 5 the olfactory, SVA vision, SSA, gustatory sensation, SVA auditory sensation, SSA and vestibular sensation for equilibrium, SSA. The first one, the visual pathway. Let's start with the olfactory pathway because it's easier. It starts at the sensory mucosa upper part of each nasal cavity. Then from mitral cells, the first neuron, go along olfactory nerves to olfactory bulb, the second neuron, passing olfactory tract, olfactory trigone to piriform area, prepiriform cortex, paramygdalic cortex, and orinal cortex, where the third neuron is located. Then the visual pathway. About the visual impulses from the retina passing through ganglion cell layer with the first neuron, with the rod and cones originating, and the optic nerve goes to optic chiasm, undergoing partial decussation, entering optic tract, each containing ipsilateral temporal fibers and contralateral nasal fibers. Fibers of the optic tract terminating in the lateral geniculate nucleus, second nucleus, arising lateral geniculate body, forming optic radiation, which passes through the posterior limb of the internal capsule, then to the lateral and posterior horn of the lateral ventricle, reaching calcarine sulcus on the medial surface of the occipital lobe. Visual cortex, however, somewhat pass beyond the thalamus to the superior collicus for the visual reflex pathway. Okay. There's also taste gustatory pathway, however, it's very quick. There's just taste impulses carried in the CN7, 9, and 10, which pass through the nucleus tractus solitarius via thalamus to the insula. Then the auditory pathway. Bipolar cells, first neuron to the dorsal and ventral cochlear nuclei, second neuron, crossing the midline mostly ventral decussation bundle of trapezoid body, across the brainstem dorsal to the trapezoid body, the synapse and the contralateral trapezoid nucleus. The axons of these nuclear groups form the lateral lemniscus, which ascends to the medial geniculate body, the third neuron, passing posterior limb of the internal capsule to the superior temporal gyrus. And the vestibular pathway, raising specialized organs of balance, past bipolar cells, first neuron, then dorsal vestibular nuclei, second neuron, fibers to the inferior cerebral peduncle to the flocculonodular lobe of the cerebellum, third neuron, and others leading to thalamus and cortex superior temporal gyrus. I believe that was it, guys. I hope you will revision, not just, or after you finish this presentation, we'll go back to the very beginning and start over. Good luck, everyone. Bye.